Hi everyone. I thought I would give just a short background on procedural rhetoric by talking about a couple of the major aesthetic issues that have been at stake in game studies in the past 15 or 20 years, really since the field has come into its own about since the year 2000. So procedural rhetoric, in order to understand where this is coming from, where Bogost and critics like that are coming from when they talk about games enacting ideas through their procedures, or procedural rhetoric being convincing, telling stories, or whatever aspect of rhetoric you're talking about at the moment. In order to understand this, you need to think first about this common artistic idea of formalism. So formalism is important in all artistic fields. It comes up in literature, it comes up in art, film, and so forth. It's got a couple of different kinds of meanings. It's not always simple to quickly define what formalism is. But essentially, formalism is a focus on the work of art itself. Formalism is the notion that all you need to understand an artwork is right there within the work, or within the text, or within the film. The relationships enacted by the work, the colors or objects, the language itself. Essentially, formalism in its, the critique of formalism would say that formalism excludes all outside context. It excludes culture, it excludes politics, history, and it focuses on only what can be found, in one given novel, the way one novel works, or the way one piece of art is working. In the early 20th century, there were even art critics, for example, focused on things like materiality. Art critics and painters who were interested in paint and pigment and texture itself and for its own ends. These material aspects of a work were thought to be its primary meaning, rather than, for example, the aesthetic movement or the culture in which, something like a Jackson Pollock emerges. A formalist would look at Pollock and say, the shapes that are being made by the paint, the textures, the way that there are some parts of the canvas that are thickly covered and some that are thinly covered, or the way that you can read his motions out of the paint. A formalist would say this is what's important about Jackson Pollock, whereas someone who is being anti-formalist might ask, what is the cultural movement that provoked Pollock to make his famous splatter works of art like that? What historical trends or political trends, what kind of statement is he trying to make? That would be the non-formalist or the anti-formalist way of looking at things. A couple of the famous names that you may have heard of, or you might want to know about, are the art critic Clement Greenberg, or the Russian formalists in literary criticism. Roman Jakobson is the most famous of them. Just a couple of the big names in artistic formalism. So, formalism in games. If we step back, we can think about the way that a lot of traditional games might invite purely formal analysis. We might look at the games, and you wouldn't be wrong to say that many games over the years are primarily formal systems. If you think of chess, for example, there's not much about chess that goes beyond, say, the formal system of various pieces and movements. You have a king, you have a queen, you have pawns and knights and bishops, and that might say something about some kind of a story, some kind of a setting, royalty versus lesser people within some kind of a fiefdom, some kind of a feudal system. But primarily, you wouldn't be wrong to say that chess is about the ways, for example, that a rook might be able to move in this way, or that a knight might be able to move in this way or this way. And the game of chess emerges from the interactions of the form of each piece. Each piece has sort of a system to it. They combine to form the formal system of the game, and that's how you might analyze chess. The same, for example, could be true of, football tactics. If you're thinking in purely formal terms, you could think of movements on the field being traced out as a kind of formalism, and the game of football itself has very little narrative to it. Some people have metaphorized it as, football is about taking and holding territory. It's a metaphor for war or something like that, but there's no direct narrative to it. It's mostly a formal system. So we can think about games working this way too. Simple puzzle games, for example. Tetris is a highly formalist kind of a system. You have certain pieces that can do certain things. The way that these pieces fit together is an important aspect of the formal system. The way that the lines work in Tetris, the simple goal is to fill them up and clear them out. And you could very easily analyze Tetris as primarily a formal system. You might go even further. Someone could say that Super Mario Brothers, for example, is a kind of formal system. I forget exactly how many blocks are in the beginning of the game, but you could say that you have Mario here, his little red hat. You have the Goomba, at the beginning of Super Mario Brothers. Obviously, there are graphics going on here. There's a narrative, particularly one that emerges outside of the game about saving the princess. There's the whole kind of universe. All of the Mario games have shared characters and a shared history to them. But you also can think of this in a formalist sense, and a formalist analysis might think, okay, here's Mario, the various things he can do. He can jump, he can move mostly forward because you really can't go backwards past the edge of the screen in the original Mario game. He can jump. When he jumps onto the bad guy, that kills the bad guy. But if the bad guy were to touch Mario, that would kill Mario. Mario can interact with blocks. He can destroy them. He gets coins or, power-ups from the blocks. Mario encounters obstacles. He has to go over or around them somehow or destroy them. And you could boil this down and say, actually, the player is capable of this set of moves. He interacts with enemies. He interacts with blocks. He interacts with obstacles like the pipe. And that would be the formal dynamic system of Mario Brothers. It's more complicated than Tetris is. I don't know if someone would say it's more complicated than chess. It's certainly rendered differently. But it's a complex dynamic system of moving parts that interact and interlock. And that would be what a formalist analysis of Super Mario Brothers would say. So within games, obviously, games have their own tradition of formalism. And specifically in game studies, the name typically given to this has been ludology. We know the word ludo for play or for game. Obviously, it's this important part of ludomusicology, the whole class. So this would be the study of games, the study of play, sort of in itself for itself. Ludologists are interested in the systems of games, in how gameplay itself works, what it makes possible. And that in a large sense is what Ian Bogost is concerned with in his work on procedural rhetoric. It's the way in which the systems of games can enact an argument implicitly. One of the examples he talks about is the SimCity series. For example, SimCity uses taxes in certain ways. You have certain things that the SimCity tax system pushes you towards. It's your primary source of income for your city. It's what keeps the game going, but in a lot of ways, you don't have a lot of flexibility in it. You have, if you set it any lower than 5% or so, you're not going to make any money. If you set it any higher than 9 or 10%, your citizens will revolt and people will move away and businesses will close or businesses will not want to open up in your city. So under the guise of a formal system, Bogost says you could also read this as a particular kind of a political statement that the 5 to 10% tax rate is sort of all you're really allowed to have. You're not actually allowed to have a kind of libertarian paradise where you have no taxes, nor are you allowed to have a serious welfare state with a progressive tax rate or something like that. The game sort of precludes this, and it presents a very specific vision of urban development and tax structure and things like that. Other examples are the Spent game, which you can see linked on the Moodle page, which is designed to have you play through the kinds of decisions that someone who's in poverty might have to make. The game Papers, Please, for example, a lot of people have interpreted that more recent game as making an implicit argument about how bureaucracy works, and doing so by having the player kind of play through it and experience it. So the flip side to ludology in game studies has often been narratology. These terms are typically posed as opposites. Narratology refers to the study of narrative as it unfolds in digital games. This is concerned with things like branching paths and branching choices. How do you tell a narrative story when the player themselves has agency? When the player can make decisions, change the way that things are going to unfold. How does this affect narrative? If we're used to narrative models that come from linear novels and film, what does it mean to suddenly throw choice or nonlinearity? What does it mean to throw randomness in there? And then on the other side of things, what could we learn from studying the audiovisual elements of a game? What can we learn from studying graphic design, the aesthetics, the way a game is presented, or music? So music, in the context of this class, music is on the narratological side generally. It's something that helps to convey the mood, the setting, the story, conveys triumph or tragedy. So in a lot of cases, I think it's clear that the player's experience of many games is actually reliant on a combination of these two things. Even in a game that's very systems driven, you these days frequently still have a story. The Grand Theft Auto games have a narrative. Zelda has a narrative. And even though it's very driven, for example, Breath of the Wild is very driven by overlapping systems of stealth and cooking and inventory and your travel and mapping and things like that, it also has an actual story to it. It presents a very specific characteristic aesthetic. It has the classic Zelda music buried at different places throughout the world for you to kind of find and discover. So really the experience of it is kind of reliant on both, but many academic analyses have tended either towards the ludological analysis or the narratological analysis, thinking about games in terms of culture, history, how they tell their stories, how they represent people, the kinds of characters that they represent, whose stories get to be told, who gets to have agency in a given game. These are important aspects, generally of concern to the narratologists, although, you could also think about these in formal terms. But generally, academic analyses have shaken out to be on one side or the other, to the point where individual scholars in the history of game studies, particularly in the first decade of it, individual scholars might have defined themselves, well, I'm in this camp or I'm in the other camp. So that's a little bit of the background to where this article on procedural rhetoric, or where Miguel Sicart's article against procedurality, where these scholars are coming from. And so if you choose to write your example, your assignment 8 on the example of procedural rhetoric, one of the things you might do is think about how music may or may not participate in procedural rhetoric. How can this aspect of gameplay that might traditionally fall under the rubric of the narratological aspect of gameplay, how might it contribute primarily to the ludological or play-based aspect of a game? And so for this, I would challenge you to think beyond Guitar Hero, which we've just talked about and written about and thought about a lot. But see if you can think of other ways or other examples in which music becomes a primary driver of gameplay, rather than simply a piece of setting or a way of immersing the player in the narrative or the setting or the aesthetic of the game.